The candle nearly fell from Nathaniel's hand when he heard footsteps on the garden path behind him. He had come to the far edge of the estate at midnight, past the hedges, past the old stone wall where no one from the house ever walked, to meet a woman he was never supposed to meet again. Eleanor stood beneath the bare branches of an oak tree, her shawl pulled tight against the cold, her eyes searching his face before she even spoke a word. "You should not have come," she whispered. "If anyone sees us, it will be the end of everything." "I had to see you," Nathaniel said. "One more time before the wedding date is announced." Eleanor looked away, toward the dark line of the house in the distance, its windows glowing faintly with the last candles of the night. "You are engaged to Lady Clara. In 3 months you will be a married man. What we are doing here is foolish." "I know," Nathaniel said, and the words tasted bitter in his mouth. "I know it more than you can imagine. Every night I lie awake and think of a way out of this engagement, and every morning I remember there is none. My mother arranged it before I was old enough to object. Lord Whitmore's family needs the connection, and mine needs the money his estate would bring. Clara and I are nothing more than pieces on a chessboard neither of us chose to play. Then why do you keep coming to me?" Eleanor asked, her voice trembling. "Every time you slip away to see me, you make it harder to let you go." Nathaniel stepped closer, close enough to see the tears gathering at the corners of her eyes. "Because I love you, Eleanor. I have loved you since the summer we met at your uncle's cottage, long before anyone spoke my name and Clara's in the same sentence. I cannot marry her and pretend my heart belongs to anyone but you." "Love is not enough for a duke," Eleanor said softly. "You know that better than I do. Your mother would rather see you unhappy for a lifetime than see you married beneath your station." A gust of wind moved through the trees, and somewhere behind them, a branch snapped. Nathaniel turned sharply, his heart pounding, but there was nothing there, only shadows and the distant shape of the house. Still, the sound reminded him of the danger they were both standing in. "Go inside," he told Eleanor gently, "before someone finds us here." She nodded, but before she left, she took his hand one last time. "I do not want to be the reason your name is ruined, Nathaniel. Whatever you decide to do it because it is right for you, not because of me." When she disappeared into the darkness, Nathaniel stood alone under the oak tree for a long while, staring at the house where his future waited for him like a locked door. He thought of Clara, whom he barely knew beyond polite conversations at dinner parties, and the formal letters their families exchanged to plan the wedding. He thought of his mother, the Dowager Duchess Margaret, whose ambition for the Ashworth name had shaped every decision of his life since his father's death. And he thought, for the first time with real seriousness, of a plan so reckless it frightened him even to consider it. If he could not end the engagement honorably, perhaps he did not need honor at all. Perhaps all he needed was a scandal large enough that Clara herself would want to leave him. The next morning, the breakfast room at Ashworth Hall was filled with the usual quiet clatter of teacups and the rustle of newspapers. Nathaniel sat across from his mother, who studied him over the rim of her cup with the sharp attention she gave to everything, including her own son. "You look tired," the Duchess said. "Did you not sleep well?" "I slept well enough," Nathaniel answered, though it was a lie. "Lady Clara's father sent word yesterday. He wishes to move the wedding forward by a month. He believes an early spring ceremony would suit the family better than a summer one." She set down her cup with a small, satisfied smile. "I have already agreed on your behalf." Nathaniel's jaw tightened. "You might have asked me first. I did not think it required asking," the Duchess said simply. "This marriage was decided long ago, Nathaniel. Your feelings on the matter, whatever they may be, do not change its necessity. The Whitmore fortune will secure this family for another generation. You will thank me one day." He wanted to argue, but he had learned years ago that arguing with his mother rarely changed anything. Instead, he excused himself from the table and walked out into the cold morning air, his mind circling back again and again to the same desperate thought. There had to be a way to stop this wedding without destroying his family's name in the process. And slowly, standing alone in the garden where frost still clung to the grass, an idea began to take shape. If Clara discovered something scandalous about him, something so shameful that no respectable woman could remain engaged to him without losing her own reputation, she would have every right and every reason to end things herself. Her family's honor would be protected. His mother could not blame Clara for walking away from a man who disgraced himself, and Nathaniel, at least, would be free. The trouble was doing it carefully enough that no one would ever suspect it had been arranged on purpose. He spent the following days turning the idea over in his mind, testing it from every angle, searching for weaknesses in the plan the way a soldier studies a battlefield before the fighting begins. He could not simply vanish for a night with a woman of low reputation, because such things could be hidden, denied, or explained away with enough money and enough silence bought from the right people. Whatever he did needed to be seen. It needed witnesses. It needed to travel through the drawing rooms of society faster than he could ever hope to stop it. That evening, Nathaniel attended a card party at the home of Lord Pembroke, one of the few gathering places where every family of consequence in the county could be found under a single roof. Clara was there as well, seated near the fireplace in a pale blue gown, laughing softly at something her friend had said. Nathaniel watched her from across the room and felt, not for the first time, a small pang of guilt. Clara had done nothing to deserve the humiliation he was planning. She had simply been born into a family whose ambitions matched his mother's. He crossed the room to greet her, as custom required. "Lady Clara," he said, offering a small bow. "You look well tonight." "Your Grace," Clara replied, her tone polite but distant, the same tone she always used with him. There was no warmth between them, no real affection, only the careful courtesy of two people who understood the arrangement they had been placed into. "I trust your mother informed you of the wedding date." "She did," Nathaniel said, rather suddenly I might add. Clara's mouth twitched, almost a smile, almost something honest. "My father is equally sudden in his decisions. I have learned not to argue." For a moment, Nathaniel wondered if she felt the same trapped weariness that he did, if somewhere beneath her composed expression there was a woman who also longed for a life she had not been permitted to choose. But the moment passed, and the conversation returned to safe, empty subjects. Weather and travel and the health of relatives neither of them cared much about. Later that night, walking home through the quiet streets with his valet a few steps behind him, Nathaniel made his decision. He would need help, someone who understood how quickly gossip could spread, and how thoroughly it could destroy a reputation once it began. He thought immediately of his old friend, a man named Charles Bellamy, known throughout the county for his sharp tongue and his even sharper appetite for scandal. If anyone could help him stage a disgrace convincing enough to fool all of society, it was Charles. The following afternoon, Nathaniel called on Charles at his townhouse, a modest but fashionable residence not far from the theater district. Charles received him in his study, a room cluttered with unread books and half-finished letters, and listened with growing amusement as Nathaniel explained, carefully and quietly, what he intended to do. "You want me to help you ruin your own reputation?" Charles said, leaning back in his chair with a grin spreading across his face. "Nathaniel, I have known you since we were boys, and I never once imagined you capable of something this bold." "I am not proud of it," Nathaniel admitted. "But I see no other way. If I break the engagement myself, Lord Whitmore will demand an explanation, and there is none I can give that will not humiliate Clara publicly. If she breaks it because of something I have done, she keeps her dignity, and I am finally free." "And what of your own dignity?" Charles asked. Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. "I gave that up the day my mother decided who I would marry. There is little left to protect." Charles studied his friend carefully, the amusement fading slightly from his expression, replaced by something closer to concern. "This is a dangerous game, Nathaniel. Once a scandal begins, you cannot control where it ends. People will believe what they wish to believe, and your name will carry the weight of it for years, long after Clara has moved on and married someone else." "I understand the risk," Nathaniel said. "But I would rather live with a ruined name than live a lifetime married to a woman I do not love, while the woman I do love watches from a distance, forbidden to me forever." Charles sighed, running a hand through his hair, and finally nodded. "Very well. If you are determined to do this, at least let me help you do it properly. A scandal poorly executed will only bring shame without freedom. We will need to choose the right setting, the right witnesses, and the right story, one that damages your reputation enough to end the engagement, but does not destroy the woman you love in the process." Over the following hour, the two men worked out the beginnings of a plan, speaking in low voices even though they were alone in the room, as if the walls themselves might carry their words back to Ashworth Hall. Charles suggested a public gathering, somewhere crowded enough that word would spread within hours, and somewhere private enough within that gathering that a compromising scene could be arranged without real harm coming to anyone involved. Nathaniel listened, his stomach tightening with every detail, aware that once this plan was set into motion, there would be no undoing it. "There is one more matter," Charles said, before Nathaniel could rise from his chair. "You must think carefully about who else might be drawn into this. A scandal touches everyone standing near it, not only the two people at its center. If word reaches the wrong ears too soon, the entire plan could unravel before it ever begins." "I have thought of little else," Nathaniel admitted. "I do not wish to harm anyone beyond what is necessary. Clara least of all." Then choose your moment with care, Charles said. A crowded room, but not so crowded that no one notices. Witnesses respectable enough that their word carries weight, but not so close to your family that they might hesitate to repeat what they see out of loyalty to your mother. Nathaniel nodded slowly, turning the details over in his mind, aware of how strange it felt to plan his own disgrace with the same careful attention he might once have given to managing the estate accounts. There was something almost absurd about it, sitting in a friend's cluttered study, discussing the architecture of his own ruin as though it were nothing more than a matter of scheduling. "You are quiet," Charles observed. "I am only wondering," Nathaniel said, "whether a man can plan his own downfall and still call himself an honorable man afterward." Charles considered this for a moment, his usual playful expression fading into something more thoughtful. "I do not know the answer to that, Nathaniel. I only know that you have spent your whole life being honorable to everyone except yourself. Perhaps it is time you were honest about what you want, even if the path there is not an honorable one." The words stayed with Nathaniel long after he left the townhouse, turning over and over in his mind as he walked through the darkening streets toward home. When he finally left Charles's townhouse that evening, the sky had turned the deep gray of an early winter dusk, and a light snow had begun to fall. Nathaniel walked slowly through the streets, in no hurry to return home, turning the plan over and over in his mind, searching for some sign that he was making the right choice. He thought of Eleanor, waiting for him in the small cottage on the edge of the county, unaware of how far he was willing to go to reach her. He thought of Clara, laughing softly by the fireplace, unaware that within weeks her carefully arranged engagement would collapse in a manner that would leave the entire county talking for months. And he thought of his mother, whose plans for the Ashworth name would be shattered the moment the scandal broke, though he told himself, again and again, that her anger was a price he was willing to pay. By the time he reached the gates of Ashworth Hall, the snow had begun to settle over the gardens, covering the frozen grass in a thin white layer, and Nathaniel stood there for a long moment, looking up at the great stone house that had never once felt like home. Somewhere behind those walls his mother was likely already planning the wedding breakfast, choosing flowers, deciding which guests deserved invitations and which did not. She had no idea that her son was standing outside in the cold, preparing to burn the entire arrangement to the ground. He took a deep breath, watched it turn to mist in the freezing air, and walked through the gates toward the house, already imagining the night that would change everything. There was no turning back now. The plan had begun, and within days, the quiet, ordinary life he had been forced to live would end in a scandal loud enough for the whole county to hear. What Nathaniel could not yet know, standing there in the falling snow, was how differently the story would unfold from the one he had imagined. He believed he understood Clara well enough to predict her reaction, believed her heart would break the moment his disgrace reached her ears. He was wrong, and the truth of what she truly felt about their engagement would arrive with a force that would leave him more shaken than any scandal ever could. The letter arrived 3 days later, sealed with wax and delivered by a boy who refused to say who had sent him. Nathaniel broke the seal at his writing desk, his hands unsteady, and read Charles's short message twice before he understood it fully. The plan was ready. Lord Pembroke was hosting another gathering that weekend, a masquerade this time, larger than the card party before it, drawing nearly every family of importance in the county. Charles had arranged everything down to the smallest detail, the room, the timing, the witnesses who would happen to pass by at exactly the right moment. All Nathaniel needed to do was appear, and let the scene unfold as planned. He burned the letter in the fireplace before anyone could find it. That night, sleep would not come. Nathaniel lay awake staring at the ceiling of his bedchamber, listening to the wind pressing against the windows, and thought of every possible way the plan could go wrong. What if Clara did not attend the masquerade at all? What if the witnesses arrived too late, or too early, and the scene lost its power to convince anyone? What if his mother somehow learned the truth before the scandal even had a chance to spread? He thought, too, of Eleanor, and what she would say if she knew how far he was willing to go. She had told him plainly, standing beneath the oak tree, that she did not want to be the reason his name was ruined, and yet here he was, preparing to ruin it anyway, telling himself it was for the right reasons, telling himself that freedom was worth any price. By morning, exhaustion had settled deep into his bones, but his resolve had not weakened. He dressed carefully, ate breakfast in near silence while his mother spoke at length about wedding preparations he barely heard, and spent the rest of the day preparing himself for the evening ahead. He rehearsed what he would say if questioned, how he would behave if caught, how he would carry himself in the moments after the scandal broke, when every eye in the room would turn toward him. The masquerade began at dusk. Lord Pembroke's grand hall had been transformed for the occasion, hundreds of candles lighting the space in a soft golden glow, musicians playing near the far wall, and guests moving through the room in elaborate costumes and painted masks that hid their faces but did nothing to hide their voices, their laughter, their endless whispering about who might be courting whom this season. Nathaniel arrived wearing a simple black mask, doing his best to appear as though this evening were no different from any other. He found Clara near the refreshment table, dressed in a gown of deep green, her mask decorated with small silver feathers that caught the candlelight whenever she moved her head. "You look lovely tonight," he said, because it was expected of him, and because it happened to be true. "Thank you, Your Grace," Clara replied, her voice carrying the same practiced politeness she always used with him. "I did not expect to see you here. You rarely enjoy these gatherings." "Perhaps tonight is different," Nathaniel said, and something in his tone must have carried a strange weight, because Clara studied him for a moment longer than usual before turning her attention back to the room. They spoke for a while longer, exchanging the same careful, empty conversation that had defined every interaction between them since their engagement began. Nathaniel found himself, for the first time, truly looking at her, noticing the intelligence behind her eyes, the dry humor hidden beneath her formal manners, the way she seemed to be watching the entire room, even while appearing to focus only on him. He wondered, briefly, what kind of woman she truly was beneath the mask she wore every day of her life, not the silver-feathered one covering her face tonight, but the other mask, the one society had taught her to wear since childhood. The thought unsettled him more than he expected, and he pushed it aside, as the evening moved forward and the moment he had been dreading and preparing for drew closer. Nathaniel excused himself briefly from Clara's company and stepped toward the tall windows overlooking Lord Pembroke's dark garden, needing a moment alone to steady his nerves before the plan he had spent weeks preparing finally came to pass. The glass was cold beneath his fingertips, and beyond it, the garden lay silent and still under a light dusting of snow, so different from the noise and laughter filling the hall behind him. He thought, standing there, of every version of this evening he had imagined while lying awake at night, and none of them had prepared him for how ordinary it all felt now that the moment had actually arrived. He had expected his heart to race with the thrill of finally taking control of his own future. Instead, he felt only a quiet, steady dread, the kind that comes not from fear of being caught, but from fear of what he might become in the process of freeing himself. A young woman he barely recognized passed close beside him, her mask painted with delicate blue flowers, and gave him a curious glance before moving on toward the dance floor. Nathaniel watched her go, wondering how many of the guests in this room would remember tonight as nothing more than an ordinary masquerade, while for him, it would mark the night everything changed. He straightened his coat, took a slow breath, and turned back toward the crowd, searching for Charles's familiar figure among the masked guests. Charles found him near midnight, slipping through the crowd with practiced ease, and gave him a small nod that meant everything was ready. Nathaniel excused himself from the conversation he had been having with Lord Pembroke's cousin, and made his way toward the far corridor, where a private sitting room had been prepared for exactly this purpose. His heart pounded harder with every step, though he told himself it was simply nerves, nothing more. Inside the sitting room, a woman waited for him, someone Charles had arranged, a distant acquaintance willing to play her part in exchange for a generous sum of money, and a promise of discretion about the arrangement itself. She was a stranger to Nathaniel, someone he had met only once before tonight, and the awkwardness of the situation settled over the room like a physical weight. "We only need to be seen," Nathaniel reminded her, more to steady his own nerves than to instruct her. "Nothing more than that." "I understand," she said. Charles explained everything. They waited together in tense silence, the sound of music and laughter drifting faintly through the closed door, until the moment arrived exactly as planned. Voices approached from the corridor, and the door opened before either of them could react, revealing two of Lord Pembroke's guests, an older couple known throughout the county for their inability to keep any piece of gossip to themselves. The gasp that followed was immediate and loud, and exactly what Nathaniel had hoped for. He did not need to say anything. He did not need to explain. The scene spoke entirely for itself. A duke alone in a private room with a woman who was not his betrothed, caught in a moment that required no imagination to misinterpret. The couple retreated quickly, whispering already, and Nathaniel knew, with a strange mixture of relief and dread, that the plan had worked exactly as intended. Within an hour, the story had spread through the entire masquerade, passed from guest to guest in hushed, excited voices, growing more scandalous with every retelling. By the time Nathaniel returned to the main hall, He could feel the weight of every eye in the room, could hear the whispers following him as he moved, could see the way conversations stopped and started again the moment he passed by. He found Clara standing near the same refreshment table where he had left her, but her expression had changed entirely. Gone was the polite warmth she had shown him earlier in the evening. In its place was something colder, sharper, though not quite the devastation Nathaniel had expected to see. "It seems the entire room is discussing you," Clara said quietly, once he stood beside her again. "I imagine so," Nathaniel replied, unable to meet her eyes. "Is it true?" she asked, her voice steady despite the question. "What they are saying?" Nathaniel hesitated, torn between the guilt rising in his chest and the knowledge that this moment, however painful, was exactly what needed to happen. "I will not lie to you, Clara. There is truth in what they are saying." He expected tears. He expected anger, humiliation, perhaps even a scene of her own, a slap across his face in front of the entire assembly, the kind of dramatic ending that would justify everything he had done in the eyes of society. What he did not expect was the long, quiet silence that followed, or the strange, unreadable expression that settled over Clara's face as she studied him. "Thank you," she said finally, so softly that Nathaniel almost believed he had misheard her. "For what?" he asked, genuinely confused. But Clara did not answer. She simply turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd of masked guests, leaving Nathaniel standing alone with a strange, uneasy feeling settling in his chest, a feeling he could not name but that would grow, in the days ahead, into something far more troubling than the scandal itself. He returned home that night uncertain of what he had truly set into motion. He had expected devastation, and instead he had found something closer to relief in Clara's eyes, something that unsettled him far more than tears or anger ever could have. He told himself it meant nothing, that grief could take strange forms, that pride alone could keep a woman from weeping in front of a room full of strangers. But as he lay awake that night, staring once again at the ceiling of his bedchamber, Nathaniel could not shake the feeling that he had misunderstood something important, something about Clara, about their engagement, about the life they had both been forced into without ever being asked. And by morning, when word arrived from Lord Whitmore's estate demanding an immediate meeting, Nathaniel would begin to understand just how wrong his assumptions had been. Lord Whitmore's carriage arrived at Ashworth Hall before the sun had fully risen, and Nathaniel was summoned from his bed by a servant whose face betrayed just how serious the situation had become. He dressed quickly and made his way downstairs, where he found his mother already standing in the entrance hall, her arms folded, her expression a mixture of fury and disbelief that Nathaniel had never seen directed at him before. Lord Whitmore stood near the fireplace, his face red with anger, a rolled newspaper clutched tightly in one hand as though he meant to strike someone with it. "Explain yourself," the Duchess said, the moment Nathaniel entered the room, her voice low and dangerous. "Explain to me why half the county is saying my son was found alone with an unmarried woman on the very night his engagement to Lady Clara was meant to be celebrated." Nathaniel had rehearsed his answer a dozen times in his mind, but standing there, facing both his mother's fury and Lord Whitmore's barely restrained rage, every carefully chosen word seemed to abandon him at once. "It happened as they say," he said finally, choosing honesty, or at least the appearance of it, over any further deception. "I was found in a private room, with a woman who was not Lady Clara. I will not insult either of you by pretending otherwise." Lord Whitmore's face darkened further. "Do you understand what you have done? My daughter's name is being spoken in every drawing room in the county this morning, not as the future Duchess of Ashworth, but as a woman humiliated on the very night her engagement should have been secure. I have half a mind to demand satisfaction for this insult." "Edmund," the Duchess said quickly, stepping forward, her voice suddenly softer, more diplomatic, though the anger had not left her eyes. "Let us not act rashly. Whatever foolishness my son has engaged in, surely it can be managed quietly. A private matter, handled with discretion, need not destroy an engagement that benefits both our families." "Managed quietly?" Lord Whitmore repeated, his voice rising. "Margaret, the entire county witnessed it. There is nothing quiet left to manage." Nathaniel stood silently through the exchange, watching his careful plan unfold exactly as he had hoped, and yet feeling none of the relief he had expected to feel. Instead, guilt sat heavy in his stomach as he watched his mother's composure crack, as he watched Lord Whitmore's genuine anger on behalf of a daughter he clearly loved, despite the cold formality of their family's arrangements. "Where is Clara?" Nathaniel asked, unable to stop himself. "Does she know the full truth of what happened?" "She knows enough," Lord Whitmore said sharply. "She was there. She saw the whispers spread through the entire hall before the night had even ended. "I would like to speak with her," Nathaniel said, "if she will permit it." Lord Whitmore studied him for a long moment, his anger cooling slightly into something more calculating. "She is at home. Whether she wishes to see you is entirely her own decision, and I will not force her to receive a man who has humiliated her so publicly." The Duchess attempted, for nearly an hour after Lord Whitmore departed, to convince Nathaniel that the situation could still be salvaged, that a sincere apology and a generous gift to the Whitmore family might smooth over the scandal enough to preserve the engagement. Nathaniel listened in silence, offering no argument, no explanation, allowing his mother to believe whatever she needed to believe, while his mind remained fixed on a single question. What had Clara meant, the night before, when she had thanked him instead of weeping? He rode to the Whitmore estate that same afternoon, uninvited, uncertain whether he would even be permitted through the gates. The house staff seemed surprised to see him, whispering among themselves as they led him toward the drawing room, where Clara sat near the window, a book open in her lap that she did not appear to be reading. She looked up when he entered, and to his surprise, there were no tears in her eyes, no trace of the humiliation her father had described so vividly that morning. "I did not expect you to come," she said, closing the book and setting it aside. "I needed to see you," Nathaniel said, "to apologize, properly, for the position I have placed you in." Clara studied him for a long moment before gesturing toward the chair across from her. "Sit, Your Grace. If we are to have this conversation, we may as well have it honestly." Nathaniel sat, uncertain what to expect, and Clara folded her hands in her lap, her expression calm in a way that unsettled him more than anger ever could have. "Do you know," she began, "how many nights I have lain awake since our engagement was announced, wishing for exactly this outcome? Not the scandal itself perhaps, but some reason, any reason at all, that would allow this arrangement to end without either of us being blamed for wanting it to end." Nathaniel stared at her, unable to fully understand what he was hearing. "You wanted the engagement to end?" "Since the very beginning," Clara admitted, a small, tired smile crossing her face. "You are not a cruel man, Nathaniel. I have never believed that of you. But you are also not a man who loves me, and I have never once believed that either. Our fathers, and your mother, arranged this match for reasons that had nothing to do with either of our happiness. I accepted it because I believed I had no other choice, just as I imagine you accepted it for the same reason. Then why did you never say anything?" Nathaniel asked, his voice quieter now, the guilt in his chest twisting into something more complicated. "Because a woman in my position does not simply refuse a duke," Clara said. "My father's estate depends on this connection nearly as much as your family's fortune depends on it. I could not walk away from this engagement without shaming my entire family, without becoming known throughout the county as the foolish girl who threw away a title for no reason anyone could understand." She paused, looking down at her hands before continuing. "But you," she said, meeting his eyes again, "you have given me exactly what I could never give myself, a reason. A scandal so public that no one can blame me for ending this engagement, that no one can call me foolish or ungrateful for walking away from a duke. You have set me free, Nathaniel, in the only way that was ever available to either of us." Nathaniel sat in stunned silence, the full weight of her words settling over him slowly, painfully. He had spent weeks imagining her devastation, her humiliation, the tears she would shed when the engagement finally broke. He had never once considered that she might feel exactly as trapped as he did, that she might welcome the scandal with the same desperate relief he had felt when Charles first agreed to help him. "I did not know," he said finally, the words feeling inadequate for the moment. "I truly did not know you felt this way." "How could you have known?" Clara asked, not unkindly. "We have spent months speaking to each other in polite, empty sentences, neither of us brave enough to admit the truth of how trapped we both felt. I suppose that is the tragedy of arrangements like ours. We are so busy performing the roles expected of us that we forget to ask each other what we actually want." A long silence stretched between them, filled only by the soft crackling of the fire and the distant sound of servants moving through the house. Nathaniel found himself studying Clara with new eyes, seeing not the distant, dutiful betrothed he had imagined her to be, but a woman who had endured the same quiet desperation he had, who had simply hidden it more skillfully than he had managed to hide his own. "What will you do now?" he asked. "I will end the engagement, publicly and formally, within the week," Clara said, her voice steady and certain. "My father will be furious for a time, but he loves me enough to forgive it eventually, especially once he understands there is no salvaging a marriage neither of us wanted. And you, Nathaniel, will be free to pursue whatever it is you truly want, whoever it is you truly want." Something in the way she said the words made Nathaniel wonder if she already suspected the truth about Eleanor, though he said nothing to confirm it, unwilling to burden her with details she had not asked for. "I am sorry," he said instead, "for the manner in which I did this. You deserved honesty, not a manufactured scandal." "Perhaps," Clara said, "but I have learned, over the years, not to waste my energy wishing for a different past. You have given me my freedom, however clumsily you arrived at it, and for that, strange as it may sound, I find myself grateful rather than angry." Before he rose to leave, Clara stopped him with a question he had not expected. "Tell me something, Nathaniel. If your mother had never arranged this engagement, if you had been free to choose for yourself from the very beginning, do you believe we might have become friends, in some other life?" Nathaniel considered the question seriously, surprised by how easily an honest answer came to him now that the pretense between them had finally fallen away. "I believe we might have," he said. "You are cleverer than most of the people I have spent my life surrounded by, and far more honest than you have ever been permitted to show. Under different circumstances, I think I would have valued your friendship a great deal." "That is a kind thing to say," Clara replied, a small smile touching her lips. "Perhaps, once the dust of all this has settled, we might still manage it. Friendship, I mean. There is no arrangement forcing that upon us, only the choice to be civil to one another for the rest of our lives, given how often our families' paths will continue to cross." "I would like that," Nathaniel said, and found that he meant it fully. They spoke a while longer of smaller things, the weather, a mutual acquaintance recently married, the state of the roads after the recent frost. And for the first time since their engagement had begun, the conversation between them felt entirely free of obligation, entirely their own. Nathaniel left the Whitmore estate that afternoon with his mind in complete disarray, the careful plan he had constructed now feeling small and foolish against the truth he had just learned. He had spent weeks preparing himself for Clara's devastation, rehearsing apologies for a wound he now understood he had never truly caused. Instead, he had freed a woman who wanted freedom just as desperately as he did, and somewhere in that realization, a strange, uncomfortable feeling began to settle over him, one he could not yet name. It would take him several more days to understand that the feeling was not relief, as he had expected it to be, but something closer to despair, though the true source of that despair would not become clear to him until Eleanor learned the full truth of what he had done. Word of the broken engagement spread through the county faster than the scandal itself had spread only days earlier. Clara ended things formally on a Thursday morning, arriving at Ashworth Hall with her father at her side, both of them dressed in the sort of careful formality reserved for occasions that required witnesses. The Duchess received them in the drawing room, her posture rigid, her expression carefully composed, despite the storm Nathaniel knew was building behind her eyes. "I have come to release your son from our engagement," Clara said, her voice calm and clear, carrying none of the shame the Duchess had clearly expected to hear. "Given the events of recent days, I believe it is the wisest course for both our families." "You are certain of this?" the Duchess asked, her tone sharp, searching for some crack in Clara's composure that she might use to change her mind. "A hasty decision, made in anger, can be regretted for years, Lady Clara." "I assure you, this decision was not made in anger," Clara replied, glancing briefly toward Nathaniel, who stood near the window, watching the exchange with a strange, hollow feeling settling deeper into his chest. "It was made with a great deal of clarity, in fact. I wish your son well, but I do not wish to continue an engagement that would bring happiness to neither of us." Lord Whitmore, though he had raged for days about the scandal, said little during the formal exchange, his earlier fury seeming to have settled into a resigned understanding of his daughter's decision. Papers were signed, arrangements were quietly dissolved, and within the hour, the engagement that had defined Nathaniel's life for nearly a year came to an end, with far less drama than he had ever imagined possible. He walked Clara and her father to their carriage himself, an act of courtesy that surprised the Duchess, who watched from the window with an expression he could not read. "Thank you," Clara said again, standing beside the carriage door, "for what you have given me, even if the manner of it was unconventional." "I hope you find real happiness," Nathaniel said, and he meant it more sincerely than he had expected to. "You deserve more than an arrangement neither of us chose." Clara smiled, a genuine smile, the first he had ever seen from her that carried no trace of formality or careful politeness. "As do you, Your Grace. I hope you find the courage to pursue it, whatever it may be." She climbed into the carriage without another word, and Nathaniel watched it disappear down the long drive, waiting for the wave of relief he had expected to feel from the moment he first conceived of his plan. Instead, standing alone in the cold morning air, he felt only a strange, growing emptiness, as though something important had slipped through his fingers without his fully understanding what it was. The Duchess did not speak to him for the rest of the day, her disappointment radiating from every closed door and every meal eaten in silence. Nathaniel bore her anger without complaint, aware that it was a small price to pay compared to the freedom he had finally won. And yet, as the days passed, that freedom felt nothing like what he had imagined it would. He rode to see Eleanor 3 days after the engagement ended, eager to share the news, certain that she would greet him with the same joy he had once believed Clara would feel at her own release. He found her in the garden behind her uncle's cottage, kneeling beside a bed of winter herbs, and she rose to meet him with an expression far more guarded than he had expected. "You have heard, then," Nathaniel said, watching her carefully. "The engagement is broken. I am free." "I have heard," Eleanor said, brushing dirt from her hands, though her eyes did not meet his. "The entire county has heard. Nathaniel, they speak of little else." "Then you understand what this means," he said, stepping closer. "There is nothing standing between us any longer. I can finally ask for your hand properly, without deception, without hiding what we feel from anyone." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, and when she finally looked at him, there was something in her expression that made Nathaniel's stomach twist with sudden, cold dread. "I heard how it happened," she said softly. "The private room, the woman Charles arranged, the entire scene staged for witnesses to discover. It was not a mistake, Nathaniel. It was a plan, carried out deliberately, to force Lady Clara into ending things she might never have ended on her own." "I did what I had to do," Nathaniel said, though even as he spoke the words, he heard how weak they sounded. "There was no other way to free myself from an engagement my mother would never have allowed me to break honestly." "Perhaps not," Eleanor said. "But do you understand what it means, that you were willing to manipulate an entire room full of people, to deceive a woman who trusted you, all to achieve what you wanted? What happens the day you decide something stands between us, Nathaniel? Will you scheme against me the same way you schemed against her?" "That is unfair," Nathaniel said, his voice rising slightly. "I did this for you. Everything I did so that we could finally be together." "You did this for yourself," Eleanor said quietly, and though her words were gentle, they struck Nathaniel harder than any shout could have. "I understand the trap you were in, Nathaniel. Truly I do. But a man who is willing to deceive so easily, so completely, to escape one kind of unhappiness, frightens me more than the unhappiness itself ever did." Nathaniel stood in silence, the cold winter air suddenly feeling sharper against his skin, the weight of Eleanor's words settling over him like a physical burden. He had spent so many weeks focused entirely on freeing himself from Clara that he had never once considered how his methods might change the way Eleanor saw him, might change the way he saw himself. "What are you saying?" he asked finally, though he already feared the answer. "I am saying I need time," Eleanor said, "time to understand what I truly witnessed in the choices you made. I do not doubt that you love me, Nathaniel, but love built on deception, however well-intentioned, is not the foundation I hoped we might build our future upon." She turned back toward the garden, leaving Nathaniel standing alone near the low stone wall that separated the cottage from the surrounding fields, and he understood, with a clarity that felt almost physically painful, that his plan had cost him something he had not accounted for. He had believed freeing himself from Clara would guarantee Eleanor's happiness, would guarantee his own. Instead, he had proven himself capable of a manipulation that now stood between them like a wall neither of them knew how to climb. He returned to Ashworth Hall that evening in silence, his mind replaying every step of the plan he had once believed so clever, searching for the moment where he had gone wrong. It was not the scandal itself, he realized slowly, nor even the deception of Lord Pembroke's guests. It was the assumption, the arrogant certainty, that he understood exactly how everyone around him would react, that Clara would despair and Eleanor would rejoice, when in truth, he had understood neither of them nearly as well as he believed. He wrote Eleanor a letter that night, though he tore it up before morning, unsatisfied with every attempt to explain himself on paper. Words felt too easy, too rehearsed, when what he truly needed was to show her, through his actions, that he understood the weight of what he had done. He thought of riding to her cottage again the next day, but something held him back, a growing awareness that arriving too quickly, too insistently, would only confirm the very fear she had spoken of, that he was a man accustomed to getting his way through persistence rather than patience. Instead, he waited 3 days before returning, and when he did, he came without flowers, without grand declarations, carrying only a small basket of the winter herbs Eleanor's uncle had once mentioned running short of during the cold months. It was a small gesture, almost foolishly simple, but Eleanor's expression softened slightly when she saw it. the first crack in the careful distance she had kept between them since the scandal. "You did not need to bring anything," she said, taking the basket from him regardless. "I know," Nathaniel replied. "I only wanted you to know I was thinking of your uncle's comfort, not only my own desire to see you again." Eleanor studied him for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind her eyes. "That is a small thing, Nathaniel. But it is the sort of small thing I did not expect from you before." Word of his broken engagement continued to spread through society for weeks afterward, some praising Clara's quiet dignity in the face of humiliation, others whispering about Nathaniel's poor judgment, his reckless disregard for reputation and honor. The Duchess grew colder toward him with each passing day, her disappointment hardening into something closer to resentment, though she said little about it directly, preferring instead to let her silence speak for her. Nathaniel found himself, in the weeks that followed, increasingly alone. Clara had moved forward with her life, seen occasionally at gatherings with a new lightness to her step that Nathaniel could not help but notice and admire, even as it reminded him painfully of what he had lost with Eleanor. Charles remained a loyal friend, though even he seemed uncertain how to comfort Nathaniel through a despair so entirely of his own making. And Eleanor, though she did not refuse to see him entirely, kept a careful, painful distance between them, her trust in him clearly shaken in ways that would not mend quickly. He began to understand, slowly and painfully, that freedom achieved through deception was not the same as freedom earned through honesty, and that the very qualities that had allowed him to escape one unwanted engagement might now be the same qualities that cost him the love he had schemed so desperately to protect. It was a lesson he would spend the following months learning to accept, though whether he could ever fully earn back Eleanor's trust remained, for now, an uncertain and painful question hanging over everything he had once believed he wanted. Snow had begun to fall steadily over the county by the time Nathaniel realized just how much his life had changed since the night of the masquerade. He spent most of his days now in quiet isolation, riding the grounds of Ashworth Hall alone, avoiding the gatherings and card parties he once attended out of obligation. The Duchess had grown tired of expressing her disappointment aloud, and had instead retreated into a cold, formal politeness that felt, to Nathaniel, far worse than her anger ever had. Meals were eaten mostly in silence, broken only by the occasional comment about estate matters or a letter that required his attention. It was during one of these quiet mornings that Charles arrived unannounced, letting himself into the study where Nathaniel sat staring blankly at a stack of unread correspondence. "You look terrible," Charles said, dropping into the chair across from him without waiting for an invitation. "Worse than terrible, actually. I have seen men mourning the deaths of relatives who looked more cheerful than you do right now." "Thank you for the kind observation," Nathaniel said dryly, though there was no real humor behind the words. "Have you spoken to Eleanor?" Charles asked, his teasing tone fading into something more serious. "She will not refuse to see me," Nathaniel said, "but she keeps me at a distance I do not know how to close. Every time I visit, I feel as though I am speaking to a stranger who happens to wear a familiar face." Charles was quiet for a moment, studying his friend with an expression Nathaniel rarely saw on him, something closer to genuine concern than his usual careless charm. "I did warn you, Nathaniel. Scandals cannot be controlled once they begin. You wanted to free yourself from one trap, and in doing so, you built another, one made entirely of your own choices." "I know that now," Nathaniel said quietly. "I understood the risk to my own reputation. I never understood the risk to the way Eleanor would see me. I thought love strong enough to forgive any method used to protect it." "Love is not blind to method," Charles said. "Perhaps that is the lesson in all of this. The woman you love needs to trust the man standing in front of her, not merely the outcome he manages to arrange." Nathaniel said nothing for a long while, staring out the window at the snow gathering on the bare branches of the garden trees, thinking of Eleanor's face the day she had told him she needed time, thinking of the quiet distance that had grown between them ever since. "What would you have me do?" he asked finally. "I cannot undo what has already happened. I cannot make Eleanor trust me again through wishing alone." "No," Charles agreed, "but perhaps you can show her, through time and honesty, that the man who deceived an entire room full of guests is not the only man you are capable of being. Trust rebuilt slowly is still trust rebuilt, Nathaniel. It simply requires more patience than you are accustomed to giving anything." The advice settled uneasily in Nathaniel's mind over the following days, and he found himself, for the first time in months, examining his own choices with an honesty he had avoided since the night of the masquerade. He had told himself, again and again, that his plan had been the only way, that his mother would never have permitted an honest end to the engagement, that Clara deserved protection from public blame, that Eleanor deserved a future free of secrecy. All of it had been true, in its own way. And yet none of it excused the ease with which he had deceived everyone involved, including, in some small way, himself. He began visiting Eleanor more often, though he no longer arrived with declarations of love or promises of a future together. Instead, he simply sat with her in the garden behind her uncle's cottage, speaking of small, ordinary things, listening more than he spoke, allowing the silence between them to exist without rushing to fill it with reassurances she was not yet ready to hear. "You have changed," Eleanor observed one afternoon, several weeks into this quiet, patient courtship of trust rather than affection. "You no longer try to convince me of anything. I have learned that convincing you of my love was never truly the problem," Nathaniel said. "The problem was proving myself worthy of your trust, and that is not something words alone can accomplish." Eleanor studied him carefully, the winter sunlight catching the edges of her hair as she considered his words. It is a strange thing, watching a man learn patience so late in his life. "I have had little practice," Nathaniel admitted, a small, tired smile crossing his face. "My mother taught me ambition and duty. She never once taught me how to wait for something I could not simply demand." Their conversations continued this way through the following weeks, small and honest, free of the desperate urgency that had once defined every meeting between them. Nathaniel found himself, in the process, learning things about Eleanor he had never taken the time to understand before: her fierce independence, her deep loyalty to her uncle who had raised her since childhood, her quiet fear that love built on a duke's whim might disappear as quickly as it had arrived. One evening, Nathaniel's mother asked him to join her in the small sitting room she kept for herself at the rear of the house, a room he rarely entered, reserved for her private correspondence and the quiet hours she spent alone. She poured 2 cups of tea without speaking, and Nathaniel waited, uncertain what to expect from an invitation so unlike her usual manner. "I have been unfair to you," the Duchess said finally, setting down the teapot with unusual care. "I arranged your engagement to Clara believing I was securing your future, but I gave no thought to whether that future would ever bring you happiness. I see now, watching how much lighter you have become since the arrangement ended, that I mistook my own ambitions for your welfare." Nathaniel set down his cup, surprised by the admission. "You need not apologize, Mother. You did what you believed was right for the family." "Perhaps," the Duchess said, "but a mother who cannot see her own son's unhappiness, even when it stands directly before her, has failed at something far more important than securing a fortune." "I do not know if Eleanor is the right match for you, Nathaniel. I confess I still have my doubts about her family's standing, but I have decided, after much thought, that it is no longer my place to decide such things for you." It was not a full apology, nor a complete surrender of her old ambitions, but it was more than Nathaniel had ever expected to hear from her, and he found himself grateful for even this small, imperfect shift in her understanding. Meanwhile, word continued to reach Ashworth Hall of Clara's growing happiness. She had been seen, increasingly, in the company of a naval officer named Captain Henry Ward, a man of modest fortune but considerable honor, recently returned from years at sea. Nathaniel heard the news from his mother one evening at dinner, delivered with the same cold precision she used for most information she wished to sting him with. "Lady Clara has been seen walking with Captain Ward on 3 separate occasions this month," the Duchess said, watching him carefully over her wineglass. "I understand he intends to call on her father soon, to discuss the possibility of courtship." Nathaniel found, to his own surprise, that the news brought him no jealousy, no lingering regret. Instead, he felt something closer to relief, a genuine happiness that Clara had found a man willing to court her honestly, without deception or manufactured scandal standing between them. "I am glad for her," he said simply, and he meant it. The Duchess studied him for a long moment, something shifting slightly in her expression, though whether it was understanding or simple resignation, Nathaniel could not tell. "You have changed since the engagement ended, Nathaniel. I do not entirely understand the change, but I confess I no longer recognize the son who arranged such a reckless scandal to escape his obligations. Perhaps that is a good thing," Nathaniel said quietly. "Perhaps," the Duchess allowed, though she said nothing further on the matter that evening. It was nearly a month after the broken engagement when Nathaniel finally understood how far Eleanor's trust had traveled toward being restored. He arrived at the cottage one gray afternoon to find her waiting for him near the garden gate, an expression on her face he had not seen since the night beneath the oak tree, when their secret meetings had still carried the thrill of forbidden hope rather than the careful weight of rebuilding trust. "I have been thinking," Eleanor said, "about everything that happened, and everything that has changed since." "And?" Nathaniel asked, his heart tightening with a hope he did not dare fully embrace. "I do not believe deception defines you, Nathaniel," she said slowly. "I believe fear does. Fear of a life you never chose. Fear of disappointing a mother whose approval you have chased your entire life. I cannot promise that fear will not lead you toward foolish choices again. But I have watched you these past weeks, patient and honest in ways I did not know you were capable of being, and I find myself believing, cautiously, that the man standing before me now is one I can trust with my future." Nathaniel felt something loosen in his chest, a weight he had carried since the night Eleanor first told him she needed time, and he reached for her hand, not with the desperate urgency of their earlier meetings, but with a quiet gratitude that felt, in its own way, far more meaningful. "I will not ask you to forget what I did," he said, "but I promise you, Eleanor, I will spend as long as it takes, proving that the man who deceived Clara and her family is not the man I intend to be for the rest of my life." Eleanor smiled, a small, genuine smile that reached her eyes in a way Nathaniel had feared he might never see again. "That is all I have ever wanted from you, Nathaniel. Not grand gestures, not scandals staged to prove your devotion, simply honesty, patient and steady, for as long as we have together." Standing there in the quiet garden, with the winter sun beginning to break through the clouds overhead, Nathaniel understood, more clearly than he ever had before, that the freedom he had sought through deception meant nothing without the honest trust he was only now beginning to rebuild. The despair that had followed him through the previous weeks had not fully lifted, not yet, but for the first time since the masquerade, he allowed himself to hope that it might, eventually, give way to something far more lasting. Spring arrived slowly that year, the frost lifting from the fields around Ashworth Hall in patches, revealing green shoots pushing up through soil that had been frozen for months. Nathaniel spent much of the season working alongside his estate manager, learning the details of tenant farms and harvest planning that he had once left entirely to others, finding in the labor a steadiness that had been missing from his life for a very long time. He received word early in the season that Lord Whitmore had formally accepted Captain Ward's request to court Clara, a development that spread through the county with far less scandal and far more genuine celebration than the collapse of Nathaniel's own engagement had caused. He attended the small gathering held to announce the courtship, standing near the back of the room, watching Clara laugh freely, easily, in a way he had never once seen during the entire length of their engagement. "You seem happy for her," Charles observed, appearing at Nathaniel's side with 2 glasses of wine, offering one to his friend. "I am," Nathaniel said, and the honesty in his own voice surprised him. "She deserves this, Charles. A man who chooses her freely, without arrangement or obligation standing between them." "And what of you?" Charles asked. "Has Eleanor forgiven you fully, or does the shadow of the scandal still follow you both?" Nathaniel considered the question seriously before answering. "I do not know if forgiveness is the right word. I think perhaps that some wounds simply heal slowly, leaving behind a kind of wisdom neither of us had before. Eleanor trusts me again, I believe, though it is a trust built carefully, over many small moments, rather than restored all at once." Across the room, Clara caught his eye briefly and offered a small, genuine smile before returning her attention to Captain Ward, who stood beside her with the easy confidence of a man entirely certain of his own feelings. Nathaniel returned the smile, feeling none of the old guilt that had once accompanied any thought of her, only a quiet gladness that their tangled arrangement had, in the end, led both of them toward lives more honestly their own. He rode to see Eleanor later that same week, the fields around her uncle's cottage now bright with early spring wildflowers, and found her waiting for him near the garden gate, exactly as she had been the day she first agreed to begin trusting him again. "You look thoughtful," Eleanor observed, studying his face as he approached. "I have been thinking about everything that brought us here," Nathaniel admitted. "The scandal, Clara's courtship, my mother's slow acceptance of the life I have chosen, instead of the one she planned for me. It feels at times as though an entire lifetime has passed since that night beneath the oak tree." "In many ways it has," Eleanor said. "We are not the same people we were then, either of us." Nathaniel reached for her hand, the gesture familiar now in a way it had not been during the anxious months of rebuilding trust, and together they walked slowly through the garden, speaking of small things, the herbs Eleanor had planted for the coming season, the letter her uncle had received from a cousin overseas, the quiet, ordinary details of a life Nathaniel had once believed himself incapable of ever having. "I spoke with my mother yesterday," he said eventually, "about us, about my intentions." Eleanor's steps slowed slightly. "And how did she receive the news?" Better than I expected, Nathaniel admitted. She has softened, over these past months, in ways I did not anticipate. I believe she has come to understand that the arrangement she planned for me, however practical it seemed, was never going to bring either Clara or myself any real happiness. She still worries about matters of status and connection, of course. That part of her will likely never change entirely, but she has stopped insisting that duty and happiness cannot exist in the same choice. That is more than I expected from her, Eleanor said, a note of surprise in her voice. As did I, Nathaniel said. I believe watching Clara's happiness with Captain Ward has taught her something my own unhappiness never quite managed to teach her. Sometimes the people we love need to see joy clearly, in someone else's life, before they can understand what they nearly cost us in our own. They reached the edge of the garden, where the low stone wall separated the cottage grounds from the wider fields beyond, and Nathaniel turned to face Eleanor fully, his heart steady, in a way it had not been on the night he first proposed the reckless plan that had changed both their lives so completely. I do not wish to repeat old mistakes, he said carefully. I will not stage a scene or arrange witnesses or manufacture drama to prove what I feel for you. I simply wish to ask you plainly, honestly, in the manner I should have asked from the very beginning. Will you marry me, Eleanor, not because circumstance has forced my hand, but because I have spent these past months learning exactly what kind of man I wish to be for you, for as long as we both shall live. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears, though she smiled through them, and Nathaniel understood, watching her, that this moment carried none of the desperate uncertainty of the night beneath the oak tree, none of the fear that had once driven him toward deception and manufactured scandal. This was simply two people, choosing each other freely, with nothing standing between them but the honest trust they had rebuilt together, one patient moment at a time. Yes, Eleanor said softly. Yes, Nathaniel, I will marry you. In the weeks leading up to the wedding, Nathaniel found himself, more than once, standing in the very spot beneath the oak tree where he had once met Eleanor in secret, terrified of discovery, uncertain whether their love could ever survive the arrangement his mother had built around him. The tree looked different now in the fading light of late spring, its branches heavy with new leaves rather than bare against a winter sky, and Nathaniel found the change fitting, a quiet reminder of how far both of them had traveled since those anxious, secret meetings. He invited Charles to stand beside him on the day of the ceremony, a request his old friend accepted with far more emotion than his usual careless manner ever betrayed. I helped you build the scandal that nearly cost you everything, Charles said, gripping Nathaniel's shoulder the morning of the wedding. It seems only right that I should stand beside you the day you finally get everything right. Lord Whitmore, too, sent word that he and his family would attend, a gesture that touched Nathaniel more than he expected, given how thoroughly he had once wronged the man's daughter. When Nathaniel thanked him for it, Lord Whitmore only shrugged, a rare warmth in his expression. Clara asked me to come, he said simply, and I have learned, over these past months, to trust my daughter's judgment more than my own pride. The wedding took place that summer, a small, quiet ceremony held in the very garden where Nathaniel had first told Eleanor he loved her, years earlier, long before either of them had understood how much pain and growth would stand between that declaration and this one. The Duchess attended, standing somewhat stiffly near the back of the small gathering, though even she could not entirely hide the softness in her expression as she watched her son marry a woman he had chosen entirely on his own. Clara sent a letter of congratulations, delivered by messenger the week before the ceremony, wishing them both the happiness she herself had finally found with Captain Ward, whom she would marry later that same autumn. Nathaniel read the letter aloud to Eleanor on the evening before their wedding, and both of them smiled at the strange, tangled path that had led each of them, through scandal and heartbreak and slow, patient rebuilding, toward the lives they had truly wanted all along. Standing at the garden altar on his wedding day, watching Eleanor walk toward him in a simple white gown, no manufactured scandal standing between them, no desperate scheme required to bring them together, Nathaniel understood, more fully than he ever had before, the true cost and the true value of honesty. He had once believed that freedom required deception, that love demanded reckless schemes and staged disgrace. He knew now, with a certainty that settled deep and steady in his chest, that the only freedom worth having was the kind built on truth, patient and imperfect as that truth so often proved to be. As Eleanor reached him at the altar, taking his hands in hers, Nathaniel found himself thinking, one last time, of the cold winter night beneath the oak tree, of the desperate plan that had once seemed his only path toward happiness. He was grateful, standing there in the warm summer sunlight, that the path had led him here after all, not through the scandal itself, but through everything he had learned in its painful, honest aftermath. 3 years passed, and Ashworth Hall looked nothing like the cold, formal house Nathaniel remembered from the winter of the scandal. Children's laughter now echoed through the corridors where once only careful, measured conversations had taken place. Nathaniel and Eleanor had welcomed a daughter the previous spring, a bright-eyed girl named Grace, who had already begun to show her mother's fierce independence and her father's quiet thoughtfulness in equal measure. The estate itself had flourished under Nathaniel's more hands-on attention, the tenant farms producing better harvests than they had in years, the household staff speaking of their Duke and Duchess with a warmth that had rarely existed during the cold years of the Duchess's strict management. The Dowager Duchess Margaret had retired to a smaller property on the edge of the estate, a decision she had made herself once Eleanor's steady, capable management of the household had proven, beyond any doubt, that her worries about an unsuitable match had been entirely unfounded. She visited often, doting on her granddaughter with a softness that surprised everyone who remembered her sharp, ambitious nature from years before, and though she rarely spoke of the scandal that had once threatened to divide the family, there existed now a quiet understanding between mother and son that had never existed during the years of arranged obligation. Nathaniel received a letter one autumn morning, delivered by a messenger bearing the seal of Captain Ward's family, and he read it with a smile spreading across his face before he had even finished the first paragraph. "Clara has had a son," he told Eleanor, finding her in the garden where she knelt beside the same bed of winter herbs she had tended years earlier, though this garden now belonged to Ashworth Hall rather than her uncle's modest cottage. "Captain Ward writes that mother and child are both healthy, and that they have named the boy after her father, much to Lord Whitmore's evident delight. I am glad for her," Eleanor said, rising to her feet, brushing dirt from her hands in a gesture so familiar to Nathaniel now that it brought a warm rush of affection every time he witnessed it. "She deserves every happiness she has found." They had remained close with Clara and Captain Ward over the years, the strange history that once connected Nathaniel and Clara transformed, through time and honesty, into a genuine friendship between two couples who understood, perhaps better than most, how fragile and precious an honestly chosen life truly was. Clara often remarked, during their visits, that she considered the scandal one of the strangest blessings of her life, however painful it had been to endure at the time, for it had freed her toward a happiness she might never have found any other way. Charles visited Ashworth Hall regularly as well, his sharp wit softened somewhat by his own recent marriage to a widow he had met at, of all places, another of Lord Pembroke's gatherings. He often teased Nathaniel about the elaborate scheme that had once seemed so clever and so necessary, though the teasing had long since lost any real sting, replaced instead by genuine affection for the friend who had trusted him with such a reckless plan and lived to build something far more lasting from its aftermath. "Do you ever regret it?" Charles asked one evening, the two of them sitting together in Nathaniel's study, while their wives spoke together in the drawing room, their laughter drifting faintly down the hallway. "The scandal, I mean. Looking back on everything it cost you before it finally brought you happiness." Nathaniel considered the question seriously, as he often did now, having learned over the years the value of careful, honest reflection rather than hasty answers. "I regret the deception," he said finally. "I regret how easily I was willing to manipulate people who trusted me, including Clara, including Eleanor herself. But I cannot fully regret the outcome, strange as that may sound. The scandal taught me something I might never have learned otherwise, that true freedom cannot be built on manipulation, however well-intentioned. It has to be earned, slowly, through honesty and patience, and the willingness to be truly known by the people we love." "A hard lesson," Charles said. "The hardest I have ever learned," Nathaniel agreed, "but also the most valuable." That evening, after Charles and his wife had departed, Nathaniel found Eleanor in the nursery, rocking their daughter gently, as the last light of evening faded from the windows. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, simply watching, struck as he so often was by how completely his life had transformed since the desperate, frightened man who had stood beneath the oak tree, convinced that deception was his only path toward happiness. "You are staring," Eleanor said softly, without turning around. "I am remembering," Nathaniel replied, crossing the room to stand beside her, looking down at their daughter's peaceful, sleeping face. "How close I came to losing all of this, through my own foolishness." "But you did not lose it," Eleanor said, leaning her head against his shoulder. "You learned from it, and that has made all the difference." Nathaniel wrapped his arm around her, and together they stood in comfortable silence, watching their daughter sleep, listening to the quiet sounds of Ashworth Hall settling into evening around them. He thought of Clara, happily married and now a mother herself, Of his own mother's slow, hard-won transformation from cold ambition into genuine warmth. Of Charles's newfound happiness with a woman who had softened even his sharpest edges. He thought, too, of the frightened, desperate young Duke who had once believed a manufactured scandal was the only path toward the life he truly wanted, and he felt a deep, quiet gratitude that fate, and Eleanor's patience, had given him the chance to become someone far better than that reckless plan had ever deserved to produce. The following spring, Ashworth Hall hosted a gathering to celebrate Grace's first birthday, filling the same grand hall where Nathaniel had once staged his desperate scandal with laughter and warmth. Entirely unlike the tense, calculated atmosphere of that long-ago masquerade. Clara and Captain Ward attended with their infant son, and the two families sat together comfortably, easily, their children's futures now intertwined in friendship rather than the cold obligation that had once bound their parents together. Watching Eleanor across the room, laughing freely with Clara as their children played nearby, Nathaniel understood, with a clarity that felt like the culmination of everything he had learned over the past years, that the life he now lived bore no resemblance to the one he had once tried so desperately to escape through deception and staged scandal. He had believed, standing beneath that cold winter oak tree years earlier, that freedom required manipulation, that love demanded reckless schemes carried out in secret. He knew now, watching his wife and his daughter and the strange, unlikely friendships that had grown from the wreckage of his own manufactured disgrace, that real freedom, and real love, required something far more difficult and far more rewarding than any scheme he could have devised. It required honesty, patiently offered and patiently rebuilt, one small, ordinary moment at a time. And in the years that followed, as Ashworth Hall continued to fill with the warmth and laughter that had once seemed impossible within its cold, formal walls, Nathaniel never once forgot the painful lesson that had brought him, however clumsily, toward the honest happiness he had finally learned to build.